there now works its way up the chain into the arm, just like a tornado. What's up guys, Ben Brewster here with triathletics.com. Today I want to talk about what is a muscling delivery or muscling up in your delivery. Typically people think about this as simply happening in the arm action, tensing up in the arm action, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, and it can happen in the lower half, hips as well. So before we get into that, I want to go through a quick recap of what exactly is the kinetic chain, and understanding the kinetic chain first will help us understand better why muscling up is such a problem when it comes to velocity and energy transfer in general. So what is the kinetic chain? Most of you have probably heard this term. The kinetic chain basically just says that energy is transferred segmentally through our body. So whether it's throwing a punch, it's not just punching with our arm, it's transferring energy from the ground up through the ankles, knees, hips, torso, and ultimately finishing from that proximal to distal path, ultimately finishing in the fist. It's no different in throwing, hitting, kicking, anything like that. The energy is transferring segmentally through your body in a wave or loop of energy, ultimately finishing into, your wrist, your hand, and ultimately ball velocity. So given that that's how the kinetic chain works, if you think about it as a chain with a bunch of links in it, the links being each segment in your body, if any one of those segments represents a block in that chain, then it's going to represent an energy leak, a segmental energy leak, and you're not going to ultimately have as much power in that particular movement. So we can think about it like a whip. If you have a whip, and when you do the actual whip motion of the whip, it's creating a loop of energy that works its way to the tip of the whip, ultimately creating a ton of distal speed at the tip of that whip. But imagine if you have one segment of that whip that instead of being a flexible, leather material, it's a metal rod or a wooden rod, a piece of that whip that wasn't able to transmit that loop of energy effectively because it was too tense. Well, that's essentially what's happening with muscling up. And it doesn't just have to happen later in the kinetic chain from the upper half. It can happen anywhere along the length of that whip if you have too much tension at a given piece of the kinetic chain. So let's go over the first possible place that you can muscle up in your delivery that we've identified that can represent an energy leak. The first place is the back hip or back leg not relaxing into landing to effectively transfer your linear momentum into rotational momentum. So let's explain this a little bit more. But first I want to back up and explain the three different pieces of an effective lower half in my opinion. So the first piece, just to give context to this, is the leg lift, or what I call the drift phase. And that's essentially getting everything started, getting the center of mass shifted forward away from the rubber to set up the second phase or the drive phase. So whether it's Tim Lincecum where he gets a big coil and gets his momentum going forward that way, or that's Jacob deGrom staying more on target and shifting his weight in that way, the initial drift phase sets up a center of mass shift, which leads into the next phase, which is the drive or pulse phase. I like the term pulse because it represents not a sustained linear push, but more of a brief application of energy. So the pulse phase takes you from that initial drift and it becomes your lateral move, your primary linear move in the delivery. That's where you're coupling knee extension, and hip abduction together to give you that primary linear component of the delivery. So that's all well and good, but you ultimately need to be able to transfer that linear momentum into a rotational move so that you can transfer that energy up the chain and ultimately get that lateral movement into the ball. So that's where the third piece of a high level delivery comes in, a high level lower half. And that's once you've run out of that lateral move, you need to be able to relax into landing, rotate down into landing, and get that back hip open to allow that energy to convert to rotational energy. So a really easy way to visualize this is looking at Jake Arrieta. We'll put him up on the video here. But essentially, he's got that dynamic leg lift, initiating center of mass. He's got that aggressive lower half drive, that linear move. Ultimately, he runs out of room on that back leg. He's fully driven off that back leg or done that pulsing action. And now this step over move phenomenon happens where it looks like his front leg is stepping over a box to get into landing. That's because he's cashed out everything on the back leg as much as possible. And now watch him rotate down into landing. He's not muscling his way into landing. He's not pushing into landing. He's effectively internally rotating that back hip and relaxing it down and into landing so that he can get the hips open and clear the hips and ultimately transfer that linear move into a rotational move so that he can transfer that energy segmentally up the chain. So I like to think of this, and I communicate this to my remote athletes, as a feeling of like a tornado or a wave of energy. And when I say tornado, when you think about that rotational move down into landing, relaxing the back leg into landing, you want the angle of the hips doing that. You want that angle to match ultimately wherever your arm slot is. So Arrieta rotates down into landing, relaxes the back hip. That angle right there now works its way up the chain into the arm, just like a tornado. So it works its way up the chain. You have this linear move, it turns into a rotational move, and then goes up the chain. So it's that type of action that effectively converts the linear into the rotational. The next way the guys can muscle up is from the low back area. You can also think about this as lumbar spine, abdominal area, and it's very similar to the previous point. But to illustrate this, I want to talk about a story from college. And this is when I initially injured my back in college. And I injured my back because there was a lot of talk online from certain gurus that if you could spin your hips as fast as possible, it would lead to greater ball velocity. It kind of makes sense in theory, except it doesn't actually work in application. So what I would try to do is use my back and spin my hips as fast as possible into landing, thinking that it was going to create higher ball velocities. What actually ended up happening is I simply strained my back pretty badly. And so I had to shut down for 8 to 12 weeks, and I got back into throwing. I was a little tentative, a little hesitant to get back into throwing because I was kind of expecting it to hurt a little bit. And so those first couple weeks throwing, I was really trying to relax my back as much as possible, not re-aggravate it, make sure I could stay healthy. And what I realized as I started going through my rehab throwing, relaxing my back, relaxing that part that I'd always been so tense when I tried to rotate, is I realized the ball started shooting out way harder than it did before. So I think I was at that point 85, 87 before the injury, and 88, 91, touching 93 that summer after the injury, after I learned how to just relax that one segment. Again, we think back to the whip analogy. That one segment had been that metal rod for me. I was rotating that all together and just trying to yank through my rotation. Suddenly I relaxed that, and now that part of my body, I could transfer energy from the hips through the lower back, through the T-spine area much better just by cueing relaxation and cueing that wave of energy feeling through my body. So it's very similar. A lot of times guys that have that muscling action on their back leg, their back hip, they're also gonna have it. They're not just blocking that part of their kinetic chain, they're also gonna be blocking this part. But I do like to make that distinction given my experience with it in the past. All right, so the third main way that guys can muscle up in their delivery is in their arm action. This is the way people typically think of muscling up. And there's a couple ways that you can think about it. One way is that the arm action hijacks the flow of energy in the delivery. So you're going through your delivery, and before the lower half has its chance to open up, transfer the energy, and finally bring the arm in, you might get to here, and then the arm kind of takes over. It takes over that flow of energy, and it doesn't allow the first half of the kinetic chain to do its job first before actively coming in. So guys will just kind of go through their leg lift, and the arm basically leads the way, as opposed to the lower half leading the way and bringing the arm in loose and late. So that's the first way. The second way that most people are familiar with is simply tensing up too much once you actually get to that point of your delivery. Sometimes this can happen when guys might transfer energy very well at lower efforts. So maybe you're doing 85% effort bullpens and a guy's throwing 90 miles an hour, and you pull out the radar gun on him and you say throw as hard as possible, and he still throws 90, maybe he throws 91, maybe he throws 88, but there's a disproportionately low transfer versus the intensity that he's now bringing. So what that means is they're tensing up that upper half, whether it's the pecs, whether it's the upper traps, whether it's the biceps, something in that arm action, they're tensing up, and it's limiting them from being able to transfer energy effectively. So if I tense up my upper traps, my pecs, as I'm going through that, even if it's a small percentage, that's gonna limit my ability to get horizontally abducted, to get that scap retraction, to allow that scap to ride the spine and get into these deep positions to retract, posteriorly tilt around my body. That's gonna limit my ability to loosely get back here and let the arm flip up at landing. So a lot of times when guys muscle up, you'll see limited scap retraction. You sometimes will see elevation if they bring the upper traps in too much, and you'll sometimes see the arm is down and late at landing at their max, on their max effort throws relative to their lower effort throws where the arm is able to flip up nice and easy. And so there's a disconnect somewhere there. You can either cue relaxation all you want, and a lot of times it will help if you change the cueing from throw hard to throw loose and quick. Sometimes when guys think throw as hard as possible, it suddenly brings in this tense mentality, this image in their brain, and you change that in their mind to throw loose and quick, and suddenly it's about creating distal arm speed. It's about snapping the whip as fast as possible, not throwing as hard as possible. So sometimes you can cue your way out of it, but a lot of times it stems from some sort of tissue tension issue where no matter how hard they're trying to relax, if their brain's holding a ton of tension in their pecs, subclavius, upper traps, the second their motor pattern, so the second they think max effort, that's the pattern they're going to revert to. So a lot of times you need to address this not just in cueing, but in your actual movement prep in the weight room, and trying to reduce some of this tissue tone and improve the tissue quality as well. So those are the three main ways that we see guys muscling up in their deliveries. We have a number of specific drills that we use on top of the cues I've mentioned in this video to actually work on improving muscling up depending on where the actual issue is. I have those listed in the actual full article write-up on our website, which you can see in the description below. And then finally, if you guys aren't subscribed to this channel, go ahead and make sure you subscribe below. Our goal with this company and with this channel is to provide you guys as much free value as possible on the topic of pitching development. Finally, if you guys are interested in remote training with us, that's what we do as a company. We've worked with over 300 or 400 athletes now in the past few years to help them improve their velocity, their body composition, mobility, and a number of other factors. So if that's something you guys are interested in, go ahead and email us at contact@treadathletics.com, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for watching.